so pleased to have with me today for our Books and Authors Sunday School series, Dr. Natalie Carnes, Professor of Theology in the Department of Religion at Baylor University, author of 3 different books, speaker at St. Albans in the past. Last summer, I believe, she spoke with us about her book, Image and Presence, or maybe it was the summer before. And she is here to talk with us today about her book, Motherhood, A Confession. I have it here marked up with many markers. There's so many good things to talk about. It's an excellent book. I commend it to all of you, whether you are a mother or not. It's deeply relevant and beautiful, sort of theological memoir confession, I guess. So Dr. Carnes, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thanks for inviting me to be here, Neal. I'm happy to be with St. Albans again, even if it's virtual.
That's right. Yes, it's a different time for all of us. Well, one of the questions I've asked all our authors is, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah. Well, there's a few different things, but part of it is that I teach Augustine's Confessions every semester to my Intro to Theology students. Because I teach Intro to Theology, and I think it's always the text my students respond to most, because it has all of these great theological explorations, but it's also in the form of a story, and a story about desire and the betrayals of desire and the conversions of desire, in a way that the students can find a way into this text more easily than they can a more just expository theological text. But there's also always parts in this text that kind of annoyed me, or parts that just make me laugh. Like Augustine's first picture of original sin is of an infant greedily nursing at the breast.
I looked with hatred at his twin, right? It's one of my favorite passages in the Confessions, because it's so, you're like, what the heck? Like, anyway.
It's this kind of funny projection of all of these adult ways of desiring onto an infant. And I think most people who have lived with infants recently are sort of like, oh, come on, Augustine. Really? That's your picture of original sin. And there's a number of other things, just, the way that throughout the text, female flesh is sort of figured as a major problem from that beginning episode of Nursing, where Augustine's first picture of sin is over-attachment to the female flesh of the breast, right? While the mother and nurses look on, and their sentimentality prevents them from being able to see the sin, while Augustine, here at a distance, is able to see that this is an occasion for sin. And then, of course, throughout the Confessions, his major sin is attachment to female flesh in the form of lust. So that even the paradigmatic sin of Augustine's Confessions is this moment where he famously steals the pears, eats pears that aren't his. It's supposed to sort of remind you of the Garden of Eden and the eating of the forbidden fruit. But it's sort of sandwiched between these stories of female flesh in a way that the flesh of the pear kind of evokes for you also the flesh of a woman. And the problematic sin there he comes to narrate is it's a sin of the creature trying to displace the creator and not sort of submitting to his status as a creature. And then later, when you see him actually also in the Garden of Milan, finally submitting to his status as a creature, what he has to give up is lust. And so he goes on to commit to a life of celibacy. So that to say, female flesh is just constantly in the Confessions as a problem. And the women in the texts, his mother is a more complex figure, but women by and large aren't able to see sin as it really comes to us. So I thought, well, this text is so powerful in so many ways, but it's also mediating this very patriarchal vision of the world. And I love Augustine's insights, but he just reaffirms over and over again the way that women are outsiders to the text, and they're outsiders to this sort of story of humanity's encounter with God. And so what if we could sort of bear this patriarchal text forward in ways that are more generative and that take seriously the site of female flesh as a site of encounter of God, a site of betrayal of God as well, but also a site of real encounter and revelation. And so this was the first text for me that really came out of my teaching. And so it was a text that was meant to speak to my students and to speak to a broader audience in a way that I didn't really think about that as much as with my other texts, my other books that I wrote. And of course, it's also a text that's come out of my own experience of being a mother while also being a theologian, trying to hold those things together rather than just always in tension.
Yes, I'm just your words. I'm thinking Augustine, his mother is nagging,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's hanging out with the boys, and that's where he's having these profound moments.
Yeah.
Except there's, his mother's a little more complicated, but that's.
He is complicated. She is more complicated. I mean, it's interesting that one of his last sort of reflections in his story is when she dies, and he's sort of like, well, okay, I grieved, I wept. And was that a sin that I wept? Does that, I mean, it's kind of a wondering that he has. Does that indicate, again, over attachment to another female body? And I think he ultimately isn't so hard on himself in that case. It's an example of how he has had a real conversion, right? So when his friend died, it sort of threw him into the abyss for a while. But when his mother died, he was able to handle it more better. But yeah, by and large, Monica, his mother, throughout the text is a real source of, there's almost a kind of, I mean, her only sin that's mentioned is that she dabbles in wine too much in her youth,
Kid,
but
especially, yes.
a little too much tippling. But by and large, she's just a figure of almost perfect goodness in a way that's also hard to get at the complexity of womanhood. I mean, he attributes to his mother and her prayers a lot of his conversion, which is beautiful. But then it's hard to get at the real experiences and complexity of being a woman in the world and your own complex relationship to your body and your life through the figure of Monica. Though I'm great.
I was struck reading it just that so much theology takes place sort of away from family, right?
Yeah.
As by yourself, thinking about God. And you do this wonderfully, like the experience, the embodied experience of being a mother, the birthing experience, the raising a child, the quotidian experience, that those places are ripe for theological reflection. And our tradition has given us the permission to do that, because the central feature of our story is the birth of a baby.
Yeah.
Which
That's
is it profound how little reflection has happened though on birth and being a mother. And
yeah. But in a way, that's the whole story of Christianity. The whole sort of milieu of it is the ordinary, right? I mean, we are central moments of worship are with bread, wine, water, oil, these sort of ordinary elements of life. And baptism is a kind of picture of rebirth, right? It's a rebirth, and also it pictures for us a kind of death and coming back to life. Birth and death are central to what it is to the Christian's worshiping calendar. So our Christian life and theology is suffused with the ordinary.
yes.
We just sometimes fail to see it, in part because it's in our ordinary going about of life. You feel so many more immediate pressures of like, I've just got to get the kids, get their dang shoes on and get them out the door to get to school on time, right? Those are the kinds of ways we often experience it. But the ordinary is also always meant to be a site of divine encounter and a way that opens up into the extraordinary life of God that's sustaining all of it.
I always think in the liturgy, you reminded me when we do have communion and I set the table, Like,
Mhm.
people are literally here. They chose of their free will to go to a place where they're watching some guy set a table. like,
That's right.
like, it's funny. And then they watch me clear it. It's like,
Right. Yeah. I
very
mean,
confusing.
yes. And there's been feminist critiques of this over the years, that all that priests do, and priests, of course, for many years being just men, all priests do is a kind of like, they claim a spiritual significance to things that women are doing all the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Feeding children,
Yeah.
cleaning, uh,
Yeah. Bathing.
washing.
Exactly. And I think it's problematic because those two things become so disjoined, right? And
Mhm.
the ordinary becomes diminished. And it becomes diminished in part by this gendering of the spheres of, the priestly sphere is this masculine area where where these activities have spiritual significance. The domestic sphere is this kind of feminine sphere where things have less significance. And part of what I'm interested in doing in the book, and I'm reflecting on motherhood, is thinking about how these two spheres are actually deeply connected. And one way of connecting them is by thinking about how motherhood images for us God. And with that, thinking about how God is a divine mother who gives birth to us, and whose womb we are reborn. And I think that these images of God help us to try to find ways of connecting and seeing the spiritual significance even of the everyday and of the quotidian.
All right, that's really powerful. It is something occasionally the tradition gets. There's some of the baptismal fonts in England that have women opening their wombs like on the font. I mean, it's explicit imagery on the baptismal font
Yeah.
saying this is the womb that
Right.
you're
Right.
going into.
Right. Right. Which is, I think, powerful also because what it shows for us is that in the sacraments, in church, it's not a flight from the world. It's a kind of intensification of what the world is. I mean, and for Augustine, all the world is an image of God. All the world is a sign of God. And that what the sacraments are kind of like more intensified signs. They're like more distilled versions of reality. They're not like completely set apart from it or contrasted with it, but they're what all the world really is and is moving towards. Like, all bread moves towards this sort of the bread of life that nourishes us body and soul. And I think that those baptismal fonts that help remind us of that connection is that's really powerful.
So just to ask the question, it's a big question that your book explores in a lot of different pages, but uh, how can you give some concrete examples you explore in the book of how being a mother reveals something about God? And then you do something else that I love as well, how the infant, the child, your daughter
Mhm.
reveals God
Yeah.
as well. So both the mother reveals something, your experience of mother reveals something about being God, and
Right.
your very daughter reveals something as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I'm exploring, because one of the things that's important in the Confessions is the category of creation. And
Mhm.
Augustine does these beautiful jobs of connecting like creation to the church and the story of what the church is and how the church recreates us. And the whole story of pregnancy is in a way also a kind of story of Genesis, right? A story of a kind of darkness and one-time void out of which we are all born. And the kind of the way that the infant is born into a kind of complete dependence
Mhm.
on an adult, and usually on a mother first. Um, Images for us our own kind of dependence upon God, the ways that we cannot sustain our own existence. Um, and then at the same time, the way that the child comes to us in that dependence is an image of Christ in Matthew 25:31 through 46, who comes to us, and those who are hungry and those who are thirsty and those who are unsheltered and those who are strangers. I mean, that's how the child comes to us, as this hungry, thirsty, needy, strange creature given to us to love. And so in that way, the infant comes to us as a Christ figure. But in much commentary in Matthew 25, it's often pointed out that that's how Christ comes to us. But Christ is also the one who sees us as hungry and gives us the Eucharist, who sees us as unsheltered and gives us the church, who sees us as strangers and makes us friends. And so our ability to receive Christ in the stranger is enabled by the way that Christ has already received us as sort of strangers and cared for us in these ways. So there's these many complex sort of layers to the relationship of mother to child. And even as the mother in various ways is an image of God to the child, that itself can become a kind of beautiful way into the divine life, or it can become an occasion for idolatry, right? Because the mother both is a mediation of God and is not God to the child at the same time. And to the extent that that's forgotten, the way that the mother also is not God, it leads to problematic forms of idolatry, which is part of what I explore in that first chapter with an episode that sort of turns on breastfeeding, the way that the mother feeding the child of her very body is an image of the way Christ feeds us of our very body, right? And there's something very beautiful about that. And yet, the mother's body is not that which sustains our life and that which sustains all of life. It's not the sort of soul-saving liquid of baptism and the Eucharist. It's not the presence of Christ. And so the episode that I explore in chapter 1 is what happens is my milk sort of dries up at a point, and I become develop this kind of idolatrous anxiety about ways of trying to recreate that kind of nursing relationship in ways that damage both me and the child. And so receiving the kind of beauty of the way that the mother can image God also entails always reminding oneself that the mother is still a creature at the same time. That's what it means to be an image, to be both something and not something.
With Christ, we're growing into closeness and closeness and closeness, more and more oneness. And you talk a lot about how with your child, you're learning to separateness and moving apart, right? And letting your child have agency and freedom, which obviously we believe God does with us too, but your child will not depend on you at one point. You have this beautiful passage where you talk about in baptism, you become a sister to your daughter, a peer.
Yes.
And at one point you will be, and this, I love this, you will be like a child to your daughter, dependent on her care.
God willing.
God willing, yes, that's right. If she assumes that task, right?
Yeah.
We occasionally remind our daughter of that too. Like, remember when we're really old.
Your 2-year-old daughter?
Yeah, no, we don't. But that's how it's different. That relationship is different than with God, where we're wanting to go closer and closer oneness. And motherhood is separateness.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's a difference of how God is present to us and we can be present to one another, right? With our hope for God is that our will and God's will become one. And that's not a diminishment of our freedom, but the highest expression of our freedom, right? Our greatest freedom. But with a fellow creature, it's different. Our hope for the sort of difficulty of parenthood, and this is something that was very also different for me from Augustine's Confessions, is that Augustine's struggle throughout the Confessions is that he has this divided will. He wants to give up lust, but he can't give up lust. And his struggle through the Confessions is for this divided will, this will that's sort of disintegrated to become one, to integrate, to unify, two wills becoming one. But in parenthood, the drama of it, as I experience it, is of one will becoming two. And especially if you start with pregnancy, right? Your child literally goes where you go, eats what you eat. It has no real will except for what it is where you take it and what you give it. But as the child is born and then grows in separateness, it's a process of learning how to help this sort of bundle of crazy desires be birthed into its own separateness. So you're learning how to pull back and where to give freedom and what that looks like to nurture a child's freedom. And as eventually your one will sort of starts separating to become two full wills, so that you can realize your sort of sisterhood in Christ. And part of where I really saw that even before when my first child was still an infant was in one of my favorite saints is The Life of Macrina. It's a text written by her brother Gregory. And
Fourth
that
century?
yeah, exactly, 4th century. So same time as Augustine, a little earlier this text was written. And it's a story of how this oldest sister basically transforms the household into a kind of egalitarian monastic community, and her mother submits to it and follows her sister's spiritual lead. Her mother is the official sort of abbess of the monastery, but it's her sister's sort of spiritual lead that her mother follows in doing that. And I think, well, that's the kind of mother that I hope to be, that I'm a mother who can submit to my daughter one day as a sister, and even as a mother, and letting her be a spiritual guide to me. And that can be like really beautiful in the abstract, but then in the concrete daily life of living with a child, much more difficult to do, and also just difficult to discern. Like, is this a time when I'm supposed to be giving freedom?
Yes, because because they're not there yet. They
Yeah, right.
you still have to do things for them, and their
Exactly.
will
Like,
is still under the control to an extent of your will, right?
yeah. And where they were last year is not where they are this year. So there's not a moment of arrival where you figured it out. You're constantly refiguring it out and rediscerning, and living in this space of sort of having to constantly submit your judgments to um, being purged of their own idolatries and proclivities to domination.
Mm. Yeah, you talk about some of the temptations of being a mother, being a parent, as a type of domination, using Augustine's libido dominandi.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about your experience of that? There's a scene in the book that's just a powerful one that probably most parents have experienced something like it. But can you talk about that a little bit in that scene?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm assuming the scene you're talking about is when we're like locked
In
in
the
the bathroom.
bathroom, yes.
Right. So it's
Parents'
this,
favorite thing, getting on conflict with their children in public. Everyone's favorite.
and even in a public bathroom, even better. So, right. So one of our struggles with one of our children was the child's refusal to say, "I'm sorry." That was just a very difficult thing for her to say. And so in this particular incident, where in a bathroom stall, she's hurt someone accidentally, elbowing them. And it's her friend who's crying. And I ask my daughter to say she's sorry, and she refuses. And then we get locked into this power struggle where, like, the child, she starts sort of like howling and resisting me. I'm sort of thinking about, like, is the other child's mother able to hear that? Are people in the restaurant able to hear this? And it's a case where what I think is interesting about parenthood is that it starts in part out of a kind of mixed motivation, but partly good, right? I want my child to have the freedom to be able to say that she's sorry and means it. I want her to be free of whatever anxiety or resistance within her that she can't do that. Like, I want that for her, and I want to help her do it. And also, I want to look like a good mom. Like, I want other people to know that I'm a responsible parent and I work hard to teach my children well. And as the kind of the standoff goes on, my sort of more sinister motivations begin to eclipse my better motivation, where I'm like, not only do I want to look like a good mom, but I'm really angry that you're resisting me and the ways that you're resisting me. And it just sort of leads to this, this fierce standoff where I sort of lose sight of, I was doing this for your good out of a kind of love for you. And now I just want you to bend to my will and do what I told you to do. I don't even care if you're doing it for wrong reasons. I don't even care if you mean that you say that you're sorry or not. I just want you to do it because I've told you to do it. And I'm your mother. And I think that was sort of disturbing to me about it is that it's not like, you know, in parenthood, like you have this love for your child and then you have also this sort of selfishness and you've got to balance them. I think that's what I thought parenthood was, maybe.
Yes.
But it's instead the way that the kind of domination can actually be funded by your love for your child, the way that the love and the domination come together, right? And they sort of are funded by one another. That the love itself can be this occasion for this desire to dominate. And what that means about how it is a purely parental love, a purely paternal or maternal love, can't sort of sustain its own good. It needs to be oriented beyond itself, or it inevitably ends up descending into these kind of protracted standoffs with your child.
Yeah, it reminds me of a friend of mine talking about spanking, which we're not going to get into that conversation about whether you should spank or not. That's up for you at home at St. Albans. But he said what struck him personally was that he found that it was so often used by him and he and his wife as a way of like quickly foreclosing the conflict for themselves.
Right.
And like to bring a sense of like, well, we brought discipline and order and the problem is solved.
Right.
Was it about the child or was it really about their own sense of difficulty and all of these other things?
Right. It's
so and with that is their love for their child, who they want to chastise to do better and to learn, and it's not separate.
Yes, exactly. Like you want a marker that you're doing right by your child, and so you try to hit these markers, and at the very but then you start to become attached to the marker rather than the good of the child. I mean, I think that's sort of exactly right. And so this sign that like, well, even if it's not spanking, I did the 3-minute timeout. And so therefore I have absolved myself of this. I washed my hands. I have restored order. I've done my part. It's much harder to keep sort of staying with the heart of the child and figuring out how to, you know, be present really to the child in the child's sort of suffering and anguish and anger, and to be present in such a way that you're, you know, accompanying the child in a journey towards the good. That's it's much easier to either neglect the child or dominate the child. Mm-hmm. Staying with the child in that kind of presence is incredibly difficult.
Sort of reminds me, this is connected with how this desire to love your child is also can be a source of temptation towards control. With your chapter on suffering, and what do you do with your child? How do you protect your child, especially in your case, a daughter, from experiencing suffering? How do you also expose and allow your daughter to suffer? I think it might just be, this chapter also is connected and talks explicitly about racial tension, racism, Jesse Washington, the lynching in Waco, which is all, when you wrote this, I don't know if you were imagining April and May of 2020, April, May, June. But.
Right. I mean, who could imagine April, May, June of 2020? But of course, violence against Black men, women, and children has been going on for years and years. And part of what I'm trying to wrestle with is the way, for me, I experienced parenthood as a call into the life of mercy, right? Like I thought when someone gave you a child to care for, whether you bear the child or you're adopting the child or foster, that what you experience is sort of like, well, this is my possession. Isn't it so amazing? Or this is like a reflection of me. And I was shocked by the kind of separateness I experienced when I first held my child in my arms, feel like this is an utterly separate creature that's a mystery and completely dependent on me. And it elicited not this feeling of like ownership or possession, but this kind of love for one who is in need, a mercy. And I came to experience the way that initiation into life of mercy can turn in multiple ways, right? That can become a kind of invitation into the suffering of the world, or that can become a temptation to flee that suffering, that in caring for this vulnerable body. Like I think almost every mother I've ever talked to has experienced this. I'm not as sure about fathers, but when you first start listening to the news after you've had a child and you hear stories of suffering children, that you suddenly find yourself just weeping and kind of wounded by it in a new kind of way. And so there's this way that there's this tug into the suffering of the world, that having a life with this vulnerable one sort of opens you to the vulnerable ones of the world. And yet the very vulnerability of this little creature, wanting to protect this creature from the violence of the world, can lead you to sort of foreclose intimacy with the vulnerable of the world. It can lead you to want to protect your child in a way that you close off the suffering of the world, even that you are willing for others to suffer so that your child can stay safe, so that your child can have a good education, so that your child doesn't have to bear with the kinds of difficulties of the world and sufferings of the world. And I think what happens in following that second path is that ultimately it ends up sort of being a real disservice to the child, because you distance the child from the vulnerable ones of the world, which are the ones by which Christ comes to us. So you end up distancing your child even from Christ, and distancing your own child from the way of mercy. But it can be so there are these like two different pools of mercy, and I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately because of George Floyd and his last words being,
"Mother."
Yeah, I can't breathe, Mama. Yeah. And I saw there was this protester, you might have seen the sign, who said when George Floyd called to his mama, it was a summons to all mothers.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really deeply true about that, the way that that this is a call to what our motherhood is and means, is that it's a nearness to the vulnerable ones of the world. But I think still further, it's also a call to the ways that we are all called to a kind of motherhood, even those of us who are childless, even those of us who aren't women. That, I mean, our picture, one of our pictures, depending on what, I don't know where the Episcopal Church is with Mary these days, but she is a picture of redeemed humanity for us, right? And her picture of redeemed humanity is as a mother of Christ, and we are all called to be
She's
Christ.
An image of the church.
She's an image of the church, and we're all called to bear Christ into the world as Mary bore Christ into the world. And what does Mary's motherhood look like? Well, when she goes to celebrate with another mother, with Elizabeth, she prays the Magnificat, right? The prayer that the mighty will be cast down from their thrones, that the lowly will be lifted up, that the hungry will be filled with good things. That's our picture of motherhood that we are all called to. And motherhood can be this kind of analogous concept where I think that's what we're all called to. We're all called to bear Christ in the world, to be mothers into the world in a way that we are part of this work of filling the hungry with good things, and tending to the lonely, and being near the vulnerable ones of the world. That's where our motherhood ends. That's where our motherhood resolves. And in our more concrete experiences of caring for this particular child, that's what that care has to be oriented to, is that motherhood that we're all moving towards, that we're all called toward. And if we lose sight of that, then the call of mercy, the initiation of life of mercy that motherhood brings us into, ends up just desiccating into a damaged and violent form of that mercy. It has to be oriented towards this final, ultimate motherhood.
You even talk about in the book how, Mary sort of pushes Jesus in John's gospel to his first miracle, that she's, I say the Magnificat all the time in morning and evening prayer. Like, it's interesting that that's Mary's, like, a mother's song.
Yes.
Like, all the songs, it totally runs counter to what our stereotypes often of motherhood and, all about protecting vulnerability of the child, sort of mothering. What we think of as mothering is safe, as comforting. And that prayer is something that's is safe and comforting, but also unsettling.
Exactly. I mean, and that's another example of where the importance of connecting the domestic with the sort of larger spiritual life that we're part of, right? That we have these sort of sentimentalized pictures of motherhood as sort of swathed in sort of, I don't know, light and blankets and comfortability and sweetness, right? Where you're just caring for these children in this house, separated from the dangers of the world, where the house is a refuge. And there is a way that a house is a refuge, but it's not a barricade. And the motherhood that Mary celebrates is a motherhood that doesn't stop with the vulnerability of the infant in arms, but takes us into the vulnerability of all God's children, and into an intimacy with all God's children. And that sort of domesticity has to open up into this larger sort of spiritual vision of who we are as humans, or it again becomes an occasion for idolatry, domination, damage, violence. Because the other side of, like, the domestic picture of keeping your child safe becomes ways that other children are sort of forgotten and cast out of that vision.
For your child to be safe requires certain financial systems to be in place that are oppressive. I mean, all of these other things contribute.
I mean, exactly. I mean, look at the school systems in Waco, and the children that are cared for and the children who aren't.
Yeah, that's right. And the way that private schooling happened here was an attempt to protect children, ostensibly, right? Protect the vulnerable. Yes,
exactly. And the way the private schooling happened, and then the way that white flight happened as well. And it's that's not to make to give any kind of easy answer to any particular parent's question of how do I care for my child in these sort of circumstances. And my children have all, for the last several years, gone to Waco Montessori School. So they are in a sort of private protected school. But it is to say that the questions of how my particular child is educated and where my particular child goes can't be thought of apart from these larger systemic questions of what about the children who can't go to these schools? What kinds of education is available to them? What kinds of protection is available to them? And how am I supposed to be part of advocating for those children as well?
It's, again, one of the ways your book does something beautiful. It shows how something like vulnerability, the experience of your vulnerability of your child, how you talk about the suffering your daughter experiences when her play ends, and she realizes this moment is lost to me forever. This sort of simple human experience can be a way, if we let it, can be a way through to reflect on something even more profound, that the suffering of people who don't have plays or safe communities to have these sorts of social events. And um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just so helpful for us to sort of think through our own, even someone who's not a mother, but
Mm-hmm.
events in my own life as occasions to either tend towards domination, towards erecting barriers and
Yeah.
safety, or towards sort of going to Christ in the vulnerable.
Yeah. I think that's right, because there can be a tendency to say, well, Neal, you as a white man cannot fathom what it's like to be the suffering of a Black woman in the world. And that's a true thing to say at one level.
I mean, yeah.
And yet, if that's the end of the story,
And I can't do anything.
that leaves you without, in a sort of affective way, into this woman's suffering. You can listen, but you don't have anything to draw on to connect it to. And so I'm interested in how this move of how it is, even in our small sufferings, even in the sufferings that can't match with the sufferings of people who are sort of starving in the world, living in war-torn, how those sufferings yet can be invitations into fathoming that suffering, into trying to go more deeply into that suffering. Because if you just tell someone, well, your suffering's not, it's not equivalent, it's not, it doesn't mean what this other suffering means, then it sort of cuts them off both from their own experience of suffering and what it can mean, and also it cuts them off from being able to sort of enter more deeply into a kind of imagination of the sufferings of others. And so it's like your suffering, our particular sufferings can't be the only way that we try to imagine the sufferings of what it's like to be Black in America today. We have to also listen to the stories. We have to also look at the statistics. But if our own experience of what it's like to experience various forms of violence or microaggressions or exclusions, if we just say that's nothing like it, then we're losing an important resource for being able to open up our own emotional lives to the lives of others, I think. So, and in parenting, I guess the important thing is trying to help children do that, because we tend to think as parents that children's sufferings can't compare to adult sufferings. This may or may not be true. I think it's probably not. But nevertheless, our task as parents isn't to say, no, your suffering isn't anything like that. It's to say, yes, you felt that. Didn't it hurt when you're excluded? Well, how do you think, I wonder how that might feel then for this girl in your class who seems like she's excluded during recess almost every day. And I wonder how she feels about that. Right. And so I'm interested in how to draw these sort of lines of intimacy among people by showing how our experiences of suffering can draw us into the sufferings of others, rather than becoming denials of either our own suffering or other suffering.
But there's something you bring up too, that like all analogy, there's limits to it as well, because then we can start to use other sufferings for our own, to make us feel merciful. Like, I was so moved. You talk about videos of civil rights, abuse against civil rights activists in the 60s. I think of like movies like Remember the Titans, or these sort of popular movies where we feel like, oh, that we feel something. I wouldn't be that way, or I feel merciful.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's sort of at the expense of Black bodies.
Right.
And whether I feel merciful or not, it matters, but not as much as like actual helping Black men and women achieve freedom and equality.
That's right. I mean, and this is one of the areas where I feel like Augustine is really sophisticated in his analysis of all the ways that mercy can become a false version of itself. His own worry about it is in going to the theater, and how when you go to the theater, there's many ways that you can be trained into a false mercy. And one of them is that all you do in a theater is you spectate. You watch these things happen, and then you feel something, and then you come away thinking, kind of like, wow, I'm a good person for having felt that, for having been moved by that. And that trains you into a theatrical version of mercy, where you mercy never sort of constitutes itself in action. And instead it sort of resolves in your own sort of feelings, and it serves to sort of buttress your own sort of sense of self-righteousness. And that's a deeply problematic way that mercy can become false. And so part of what that leads me to wrestle with is, then what does it mean to listen to the news, and the ways that, I mean, there have been activists that have pointed out the ways that there's all of these videos. You can watch so many videos of Black men and women dying on YouTube, right? And at what point does that become a kind of spectacle rather than becoming a sort of way into the suffering of the world, and a way for fighting for equality and justice and for nonviolence? And I don't think that that's a question easily resolved, because images do seem to move us to action in a way that dry reports don't. I mean, I think of the image of the Syrian drowned toddler that sort of galvanized the world towards Syria a few years ago. And yet those very images that galvanize us to action can become spectacles that where our attention sort of begins and ends, and instead, Black bodies become an occasion for my own feelings about myself, or they can even become, those images can even sort of feed even more sinister impulses than that.
Yeah, that Black bodies exist to be abused, right? That we don't see images of Black bodies being strong and powerful, integrated, whole, sound, asserting themselves in the world in positive ways, but we only see images of subjugation.
Right. Yeah.
It's problematic.
It's very problematic. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Natalie, I wish you would have solved made all these things easy.
Right. I mean, if only I could give us all a tidy answer of how to live well in the world.
You do provide some definite guidance, though. I especially, you have this passage about that I loved, and it was about parenthood as a type of asceticism. It's shifting gears a little bit, but it's deeply connected to this. That this is on page 130. That parenthood demands a kind of asceticism, but like all asceticism, its end is extravagance. That you fast not as an end in itself, but for some higher good. That you allow your daughter to experience suffering, to allow her the freedom of her own will, discipline when appropriate, not as an end in itself, but for her to be fully human.
That's right.
And I think that's just a helpful way for us to think about being a parent, being someone who has others in your charge.
Right.
It also requires, and you talk about this, that you be free and integrated yourself, which I think is the difficult part.
Yes. I think probably most of us don't realize when we sort of agree to be parents that we're signing up for an ascetic activity, that it's going to require so much work on yourself, that you can become angry and dominating and fearful in ways that you didn't know you could before that. And you can't hide who you are as a person. And in so many of our relationships with people, it is possible to have those friendships, those collegial relationships, by putting on your good face and going into them, presenting yourself how you want to be presented. You can't hide from yourself in that way as a parent. Your true self will come out. And so if you want to raise a child who is perfectly free to love without fear, then you've got to work on your own self and your own unfreedoms, and the places where you realize you are captivated to various fears, anxieties, idolatries that have to be rooted out. And to the extent that you avoid that work, you're also hampering yourself in your end of raising a child who's perfectly free as well.
You also talk about how it's you don't have to begin being, or you don't just reality. You don't begin life as a parent like fully formed. Like I'm a fully formed, integrated person. Now I have a child who I can responsibly raise. You always sort of begins, and you're in the process of becoming as well. Yeah. And so in that sense, raising a child can help.
Right.
In your own, in healthy ways, in
yes.
your own growth.
Yes.
In love towards others and towards God.
That's right. I mean, having a child is apocalyptic in the sense that it's a kind of unveiling of who you are as a person. And it reveals to you a lot about where you are in your life with God. And then you can choose to try to hide that or cover that back up, or you can choose to work with it. And there's other activities that do that as well. I'm not wanting to suggest that parenthood is the only way that, I mean, clearly that's not true. I mean, monasticism is, in the Christian tradition, usually the higher way, the better way. But it's definitely a very powerful way, and particularly in our culture now where we tend to value able-bodied adults and people at the ends of life and people with disabilities, people who lose their abilities. Those people our society doesn't know what to do with as well. And so then when you're suddenly thrust
they can't make money.
Yeah, exactly.
The problem with children, they can't make money, right?
Exactly. Even their lemonade stand, you end up having to.
Yeah.
That's right. They're not productive, right? They don't produce, and so we don't know what to do with them. And in parenthood, you're suddenly thrust into daily care for these sort of non-productive creatures, and elder care you are as well. And that can reveal a lot about yourself to yourself. It can also reveal a lot about the world and the ways that our society is organized to yourself, and can in that way become a real occasion for sanctification and for the work of helping to leaven and transform the world.
Yeah, you talk about playing with your daughter. I think it's sort of common experience, like it gets kind of boring, right? Like your daughter wants to do the same thing again and again, and you've moved on.
Right.
That on the one hand, there's a tension there, right? Like there's something to being an adult with tasks and goals. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And in organized way of life that children just don't seem to naturally have.
Right.
But there's also something to learn from the play.
Yeah.
That sort of that life is a gift. And
yeah. I mean, absolutely. Maria Montessori has this beautiful way of thinking about children and adulthood, and adults as sort of two poles of human existence that need to be held together, and they need to be in relationship with one another. And even if you don't have children, you need to be in relationship with some children, because the way that play is just so sort of natural to childhood. In a lot of ways, of course, adults show children who they're going to become. But in other ways, children also show adults who we're supposed to become. There's this really interesting trajectory from Joseph Ratzinger, the former Pope Benedict the 16th, and Romano Guardini, who both wrote books on liturgy, talking about liturgy as play, and children's play as showing us something about what we're doing in this sort of non-productive, repetitive activity that we do as worshiping people. And that play and worship are quite intimately connected, the capacity to play and the capacity to worship. So in some ways, children sort of remind us of this parts of ourselves that can get lost in the kind of day-to-day, putting food on the table, making the world go around type of things. It's obviously irresponsible of adults to like play all of the time and abandon their responsibilities to produce and care for their children. But it's also a kind of, it's a drying experience for the soul to lose touch with that sort of playful side of yourself, which is so easy to do in the activities of adulthood. And that children can help us stay in touch with our own playfulness, can give us even a new playfulness that helps us to be better worshipers of God.
Yeah, you connect it with David
Yes.
dancing before the altar,
Yes.
and Michael, his wife, sort of looking on scornfully, and you do something, you complicate even that, right? Part of the reason David's able to dance and look a fool is because of gender politics at the time, and the difficulty. Would Michael have been accepted if she was in her underwear dancing before the ark?
Yeah.
Probably not. No.
Right.
But it is a beautiful image of play and worship.
Yeah. That kind of like abandonment, right? I think is one thing that we can, that is a sort of beautiful picture of like, wouldn't we all love to have that kind of freedom before God where we are, all this is complicated. He was king, he was a man, whatever. But like a picture of like, I don't care what people think. Like, I'm just so joyful of the presence of God that it inspires this kind of dance. Like, I'm going to forget these duties that I have for a time. I'm going to forget what people think and just enter into the joy of the presence of God. Like, how beautiful. And children, what's so like humbling is that children, especially babies, have that kind of joy at our presence.
Yeah.
I mean, Montessori talks about how little babies, even before they eat solid foods themselves, will just gaze at the adults eating at the table, content to just watch them eat and be in their presence, even though they're not themselves going to enjoy the food. And I think that kind of like adoration that little ones can show for us is also the kind of adoration that we're invited into in our life with God.
When my mom comes to visit us, or sometimes when I come home from work, my daughter Elizabeth too gets so excited. She just runs like, yeah, and just waves her arm. She doesn't like give anyone a hug, but it's just like, just running around, like just yelling in joy. And it's a beautiful image of just being fully present. And may we all be that way sometimes.
Yeah, that kind of beautiful, just kinetic joy that's just so bodily.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. We didn't touch on half the things that I would love to talk about in the book. Is there any other thing? We didn't talk about the style it's written in, which is super interesting. You write it, most of the book, in first or second person to your daughter. And then it shifts to writing to God and how these are connected. But are there any other things you would like to add before our time is out?
No, not really. I guess and the style, it is, I'm sort of also experimenting with what feminist theology is and can be, and the ways that our imaginations of God also need to shift in the way that different genres can be helpful to that. The way that Augustine's Confessions sort of captivates us, not just sort of intellectually, but also captivates us imaginatively, giving us a kind of way into imagining our life with God. And so I'm trying to sort of build on what Augustine's done by expanding his picture of who God is and how God comes to us. And it's meant to reach people who have never even read the Confessions. The hope is that it's a story and reflection that will appeal to people and be accessible to people, even if you've never even heard of the Confessions.
And you don't have to have read the Confessions at all to enjoy it. And it is a page turner, if I could say that about a book of theology. Like, you want to keep the style of writing is compelling and is effective, and you want to keep turning the page.
Thank you. That was
success. It's great. One last question I've asked everyone. What is your family doing to survive? What are you doing? Let's family aside here for a second to survive in COVID-19 or Corona tide.
Yeah, well, I think it's a little harder, but it's gotten hot. We were so, I felt so blessed to that April and May were so mild for Waco. And one of the things I really enjoyed was walks with my girls. Sometimes they would complain about it. Most times they would, but once we were actually on the walk, about 20 minutes in, they would usually start to sort of relax into it, and we just had really great conversations. I mean, I probably most people who have written before, you might experience this thing where you're sort of stuck and you go for a walk and it's like your thoughts start to move as your body moves. And I found that with my girls as well, that like their thoughts moved in different ways when we walked together. And we also used that time to memorize things together, which was fun. Like Psalm 23 and things. I've also been very fortunate to that my sister-in-law lives with us, and so we've had a whole little community in our house. I have 3 girls and my sister-in-law, and we've just started bubbling with 2 members of your congregation, the Hayworths, and Courtney's helping with the girls. And so having sort of ways of maintaining community in our lives has been really important. And I think what will be important for the summer is that we just got one of those above ground pools.
Redneck pool. We have one too.
Yeah, we decided this about a month ago, and we were like, okay, let's go to Academy. And we're like, oh no, Academy sold out. And we're like, how about the academies in the area? Eventually, my husband drove to San Antonio to do curbside pickup or one of these.
What a champ.
And but I think it's gonna be worth it, because it's as it becomes 100 degrees over the summer, having a way to cool off and not just feeling like you're cooped up indoors will be important for us.
Yes, the great long summer begins. And
great long summer, and sometime in October if we're lucky, November if not.
That's right. Oh, well, Natalie, Dr. Carnes, we're so grateful for you to talk with us about your book, Motherhood. I encourage all of you to buy it. It's a beautiful book, and we are so glad to have you.
Thanks, Neal. It's a pleasure to be virtually here and have this conversation with you today.